like to invite Dr. Peter Larson, Chair of OFIT, for a Q&A session.
The way the Q&A is going to work is I'm going to ask, for the first 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to ask Ali what I think are some hard questions, and then we'll open up the floor, and you can ask your questions. Just as we get into it, I'm going to ask Ali a couple of sort of light questions, and one intrigues me. Ali is born in Chicago.
No, I was born in Washington.
Born in Washington, and you went to school in Chicago?
Later at the university.
Okay. You don't sound like someone who either was born in Washington or lived in Chicago. So tell me a little bit about why you sound the way you do.
I have a mic, but I don't know if it's still on. Did this turn off? Hello? Yeah, okay. There we go. Actually, people in Chicago sound like all kinds of different things, so just to say that. But no, I grew up my first years in the UK and came back to the US later when I went to university. So
You sound like a queen to me.
Our
queen.
Yes, I know. When I arrived at Ottawa Airport, there's a big portrait of her. And it says, and I said, first of all, it's nice to be welcomed by one of the locals. But then it says also Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada. But wouldn't she be Queen Elizabeth I of Canada?
Very interesting. Ali, also want to ask you say a bit more about the electronic Intifada. Where do people find it? What does it do?
Yes,
how much does it cost?
Maybe while I put that up, maybe while I talk about that, could Hashmat maybe put it up, because then people can see it.
Yeah.
But basically, we're a newspaper, an online newspaper. That's the simplest analogy. But our focus is Palestine, and we were founded in 2000, and I don't even know what the top story is today because I've been traveling, so I can't wait to see the front page.
We were hoping to see your visit here on the front page.
No, we don't report on my activities, but we were founded in 2001, so that makes us one of the oldest online publications in the world, probably. We work with wonderful journalists in Palestine, a lot of young writers in Gaza. They do original reportage. We mentor them. We work with videographers, with photographers. They are all first-rate. This is first-class journalism. I don't say that because I'm involved in it. I say that because they're involved in it. And they're really doing a fantastic job. As well as a lot of political analysis, arts, media criticism, you name it, we do it. And it's all independent. It's all funded by donors, just as your activities are. We're supported by thousands of people, including people across Canada. Anyone can go online and hit the Donate Now button.
So you would accept Canadian dollars, would you?
We do. We like you to mark it up a bit because they're not worth as much. No, we absolutely do, and that's. I mentioned that not because of course I want people to donate, but that's not why I'm mentioning it. It's because that's the only way to do this kind of journalism. As you know, corporate media and state-linked media, whether it's the CBC or the BBC or anything else, will not get into this story the way we can. And so that's why it has to be independently funded, and I'm very proud of my teammates and our reporters, and I encourage people to take a look at it.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask you a harder question.
Okay.
Ali, you've talked about a one-state solution. Do you think that Jews or Zionists have any right to live in Jerusalem or Hebron or wherever?
Well, that is not a hard question, but it's a question that requires us to unpick certain terms. When you say Jews or Zionists, first of all, those are two different things, as I pointed out. And secondly, when you say Jews, what if I said the Christians have a right to live in Jerusalem? Now remember, the idea of Zionism was a Christian Protestant idea to begin with. The idea that Jews don't belong in Europe and belong somewhere else. And this was also part of the Messianic Christian fundamentalist ideology in which Jews had to return, quote, return to Palestine in order for biblical prophecy to be fulfilled. So we can't simply assume that there's some natural idea that Jews, wherever they are or wherever they come from, are indigenous to Palestine. Because we don't say that about Christians. We don't say any Christian should have a right to go and live in Palestine or a right to live in Jerusalem, because nobody disputes that Palestine is the birthplace of Christianity. But it doesn't follow, therefore, that every Christian is descended from ancient Palestinians. But that argument was constructed in the late 19th century and early 20th century with respect to Jews, so I don't accept it. There's no question, of course, that Jews, that the Jewish religion, Jewish faith, Jewish tradition have reverence for Jerusalem, for the Holy Land. That's not in dispute. That doesn't contradict or conflict with anything I've been saying. The fact that Jews, Muslims, Christians consider a place to be holy is great. No issue with that. Should they come there, worship there freely? Absolutely. The question is, what about Israeli Jews? There, the answer is not in their Jewishness. The answer is in an analysis of settler colonialism. In trying to unravel settler colonial situations, the basic deal is that the settlers give up their power and privilege, return and restore, give restitution to the indigenous people. They all accept equal citizenship. There have to be processes of truth and reconciliation and restitution. You can't just say everyone's equal now when there are these major disparities. It has to be more than that. And the settlers then become citizens. So in that respect, Israeli Jews have a right to live there. They have no other place to go. People say, oh, well, they can go back to... Yeah, but they can't go back to their countries because the vast majority of Israeli Jews were born there. So the analogy would be to white South Africans, where you give up your power, you give up your privilege, you give up your monopoly, and you gain citizenship. And in that respect, I don't see any issue. In this future state, or future entity, there would be no issue with recognizing and protecting people's language, people's culture, people's religion. I don't think there's any Palestinian that will object to that. I'm saying that, you know, here, and people can challenge me, but I've never heard a Palestinian say, we don't want Jews to practice their religion, or we don't want Jews to have access to their holy places, or we don't want people to speak their language and teach their children their language. I've never heard that. The issue is to do those things and to argue that you Palestinians have no right to do them either, or rather that you have no right to. That's the issue. Exclusive exercise of power.
Okay. I have a quote here from a very well-known Israeli novelist by the name of Amos Oz. Amos Oz wrote many novels. He died last November. And I have quite a significant quote, I think, from his book called Dear Zealots. I want to read the quote to you and get your reaction to it. He says, Jews, this is Amos Oz, Israeli novelist, writing, Jews and Arabs can and should live together. But I would find it absolutely unacceptable to be part of a Jewish minority under Arab rule. Because almost all the Arab regimes in the Middle East oppress and humiliate their minorities. And more importantly, because I insist, is Oz speaking, I insist on the right of Israeli Jews, like any other people, to be a majority. if only on a tiny strip of land. So the question I want to ask you is, he's speaking out of a place of fear. Are his fears legitimate? Does he have reason to fear what might happen to Israeli Jews if they were to become a minority?
You know, Amos Oz has this undeserved reputation, particularly in the West, as being this peacenik and this, you know, liberal, and when he died there were all these obituaries. But I think that quote really summarizes his racism. No country has a right to have a particular demographic composition, especially at the expense of the indigenous people. That's what the apartheid South African regime said. And the arguments that he gives are precisely the same as the ones that were made to defend apartheid in South Africa, almost to the word, which is that whites have a right to self-determination, and apartheid is what guarantees that self-determination. And look at the rest of Africa. It's all civil wars and dictators and oppressions, and if we end apartheid, South Africa will become another black dictatorship. And that's exactly what he's saying. His analysis is, of course, devoid of any context of what has happened in the surrounding Arab countries in terms of colonialism, in terms of continued interference in their governance, and so on, and reduces it to some kind of cultural trait that Arabs just don't know how to treat people, when in fact minorities have done very well in many Arab countries. If you go next door to Jordan, you see churches and mosques next to each other. The destruction of Iraq's Christian community in the last 10 years came after the US invasion. Up to that point, Christians had been living in Iraq. The same in Syria until the war of the last 7 or 8 years. So this idea that, you know, Arabs that just would murder Jews in their beds is exactly the same rhetoric that was used to justify apartheid. Is the fear justified? The fear is not justified, but the fear is there. And the fear is what happens when you, who have exercised total control over other people and participated in their oppression, give up that control. Will they rise up against you? And I suppose I can understand why that fear is there. But the way to deal with it is not to say, well, therefore we have to continue the oppression. The answer is, the sooner you end the oppression, and the sooner you do it on reasonable and livable terms, the better you secure your future. That's the only answer I can give.
I had a conversation at lunch last week with a former Canadian ambassador who we were talking a bit about your topic. And he said, look, the idea of a one-state solution where everybody lives together in equality, that's a wonderful idea, but the Israelis will never go for it. So why do you waste time chasing after an impossible future when you could get some energy around a two-state solution, which would be a compromise? So why do you chase something impossible? What isn't a half a loaf better than none?
I'll answer that, but I had been looking for this article when you were speaking. Some people might have seen it. I'll just read one paragraph from it, but it's from 1989, from the Christian Science Monitor, and it's called "South Africa Shouldn't Be Singled Out." And one paragraph, it's the argument as it's referring to. Once vibrant, the 42 black-ruled states in Africa have now disintegrated into a political, social, and economic nightmare. Under colonial rule, these states produced 95% of their own food. Today, despite their richness in natural resources and manpower, these countries have increasingly become beggar states. Adding to the problem, Africa's population is growing at an alarming 3% a year. Experts warn of the worst disaster the world has yet seen, mass starvation. And of course, the article goes on to say how there's all this condemnation of whites. Why isn't anyone criticizing the blacks? And it's all there. And the same arguments were with respect to one person, one vote. In this book, in The Battle for Justice in Palestine, I actually went back and looked at the opinion polling among whites in South Africa in the 80s and early 90s. And surprise, surprise, the vast majority of whites said they would never accept one person, one vote in South Africa. F.W. de Klerk, as late as 1989 or 1990, I have the quote here, said that one person, one vote would be the death knell for South Africa. And of course, what happened in 1994 was that there was one person, one vote, and that's still the case in South Africa. So if you had followed the same logic and said, people did, they said, well, whites will never accept it, so therefore you can't have it. But that's always true. Which oppressive system agrees to give up power voluntarily? And where in the world have beneficiaries of such a system voluntarily given up those benefits? It doesn't happen. I mean, in 1950, you wouldn't have, you would have said, well, whites in Alabama or whites in Mississippi will never accept for black people to vote and have equal rights. And frankly, many white people in America still don't accept it. But the last thing you would do is give those people a veto.
Ali, I have many more questions on my list, but I'm going to move to turning it over to the floor. I see people moving towards microphones already. So the rules they're proposing is that we'll do three at a time, 3 questions at a time. Please keep it to a minute. And I say it can be a question or it can be a comment. If you disagree, that's just fine. Well, it's not fine. You're supposed to agree, but you can speak up if you disagree. Do so respectfully, and also that works both ways. We invite people who disagree to speak respectfully. We invite the audience to listen to them respectfully. If you hear people you don't understand, yes.
Could you just make sure that it's gender parity? Could you just make sure that it's like?
I don't see any women, so it's no problem.
There is in that.
Okay. Well, so we'll encourage people on the lines to sort of keep that notion in mind. Okay, there. Thank you very much for raising that, Nina. Okay. So as I was saying, pose your question, make your comment respectfully, or if you disagree, no hissing or booing, just listen to what someone says and so on and so forth. And please line up at the microphones, and we'll start off over here. Take 3 questions first. One for each of 3 people.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I will squeeze 2 comments and 1 question in 1 minute. The first comment is for Amos Rose. Jews lived in Palestine without any single intifada against them or riots until 1920. So only after the Zionist project there, then the riots started and the problems started. Number 2, I think for the colonialism, what is common between Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand is that all the reconciliation thing happened only when the settlers became 95 to 97% of the population. It didn't happen because of good conscience and they became nice off of the sudden or acute colonialism. No. And because Palestine is far away from having the settlers become 97%, I think it's not fair to compare to these places. With South Africa, it's the opposite. When the settlers became 9%, then they are afraid about their continuity, and also the world stood against them. So really there is no relation between those and Palestine, Israel. The question is, who are you going to talk to with this one-state solution? To the Palestinians, to the Israelis, or to the international law? Even if the Palestinians agree to that, they cannot implement it. Israel cannot accept 20% to have equal rights, equal civil rights. How they will accept 50%? The international law with the 2-state solution, they are all agreeing to it with hundreds of United Nations Security Council resolutions, and they still didn't push Israel to implement it.
Okay,
they will implement one state? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, over here.
I don't think this is working.
As you know, what happens in Palestine, Israel, is very much going to be influenced by what happens in the United States, especially during the coming elections. I'd like you to try to evaluate the long-term effect of the intervention by Ilhan Omar in the Congress, as well as the statements made by Bernie Sanders about the future of Palestine.
Thank you very much. Third one.
Since out probably of total desperation, you seem to be focusing more on Canada than on what goes on in the United States. I'll give you a Canadian question. What is your take on the fact that our present government, despite all its lofty ideas, has barely enunciated a single proposal, idea, or what on the Israeli peace process or lack thereof after 10 years of quasi-hostility towards the Arab world on the part of the previous government?
Thank you.
All right, those are three very rich questions, so I'll try to address them as quickly as I can. Look, Israel will not accept any solution. Again, if it's about asking nicely and saying, please, will you stop oppressing us, there'll be no solution. Not 2 states, not 1 state, not 10 states. So there has to be a struggle. People living under occupation and colonialism struggle for their rights. So Palestinians resist. They have a right to resist. Resistance takes many forms. It can take the form of armed struggle, but it can take other forms. And we've seen the growth of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is a form of international solidarity which aims to change the balance of power. Why did the South African apartheid regime begin to negotiate when it had refused for 40 years? Because it started to see that the price of the status quo was getting too high to bear. So as long as Israel has impunity, as long as Israel is enjoying normal relations with the world, they don't have any incentive to change. So you have to change the calculus. Unfortunately, the UN isn't doing its job. Governments aren't doing their jobs. Palestinians don't have that many means at their disposal, but they have called for international pressure on Israel in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, again modeled on South Africa. Of course, I acknowledge no 2 situations are similar, but it's not just my word. There's a lot of good analysis from scholars in those countries as well as internationally on the similarities and differences of settler colonialism in all these places. And you're right. It's easy to talk about reconciliation in Canada when you're talking to 3% of the population. I don't dispute that. That's why Israel, the official ideology is not just no reconciliation, but actual Nakba denial, because they see that the Palestinians are a real threat to the existence and legitimacy of the Israeli state. But so the short answer is Israel will accept no solution voluntarily, but you don't ask the perpetrator or the criminal. And I think Israel is a criminal. I'm not saying all Israelis are criminals. I'm saying the Israeli state, as an apartheid state, is an entity committing crimes. You don't ask the criminal, please, will you stop being a criminal? You have to do something about it. That's unfortunately, there's no shortcut. Regarding the U.S., Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders, briefly I'll say that the emergence of Ilhan Omar, she's a wonderful...
Not everybody might have followed it.
Yes, Ilhan Omar is a newly elected a member of Congress from Minnesota. She is a refugee, came to the U.S. as a refugee from Somalia. She made history as one of the first black Muslim woman elected to Congress and one of the first 2 Muslim women in Congress. But she goes far beyond this sort of identity symbolism to really speaking clearly about U.S. imperialism and U.S. foreign policy and how it has created chaos and violence around the world. And predictably, there has been an incredible racist, Islamophobic backlash against her, not just from the right that you'd expect, but from her own Democratic Party, and it's been disgraceful. She has been smeared and falsely accused of anti-Semitism in recent weeks, utter lies. She made perfectly legitimate comments about the Israel lobby group AIPAC and about the influence of the Israel lobby, and the press published lies claiming that she was accusing Jews of dual loyalty. She said no such thing. But all of that is a reaction to what Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders represent, which is a sea change in the grassroots of the Democratic Party. The establishment is still very pro-Israel and sticks to the talking points. But the grassroots is demanding change. There is huge support for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And this has forced Bernie Sanders, who doesn't have a great record on Palestine, forced him to start speaking up, pushed him and others to take positions. So there is a battle now within the Democratic Party over Palestine, and it reflects a surge of grassroots support. You don't see it at the top, but it's there, and that's very encouraging. That's why you can't talk about the United States as a monolith, because really things are changing. It's going to take a while. And I think, of course, I'm no expert on Canada, but there are similar phenomena going on in Canada. We saw over the last year a similar debate within the NDP, which the party leaders had to use undemocratic means to prevent a pro-Palestine resolution coming to the floor at the NDP conference because they were afraid it would pass. The Green Party, which is smaller but still is there, already supported BDS. Justin Trudeau has really been utterly disgraceful in his deliberate and repeated conflation of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement with anti-Semitism. And that is something we've heard from other Western politicians. It's an Israeli talking point to conflate BDS, a peaceful, non-violent movement for human rights on the one hand, with anti-Jewish racism on the other hand. We all must reject anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish racism as we reject all kinds of racism. But to claim that BDS is anti-Semitic is not just wrong, it's not just a complete betrayal of the facts. I would say it's also anti-Semitic, because when Justin Trudeau makes such statements, he's assuming that all Jews support Israel, and that all Jews identify with Israel, and that Israel actually represents all Jews. And that conflation is in itself anti-Semitic. And what he also does is erases the voices of Canadian Jews who don't accept that. And I understand that Diana Ralph was supposed to be with us this evening, but was delayed getting back into town. But she was the author of this wonderful study that came out a few weeks ago of Canadian Jews, which shows that among Canadian Jews, as among all Canadians, there is a great diversity of opinion. A significant number would support boycott of Israel. A majority rejects the notion that criticizing Israel is automatically anti-Semitic. But you don't see that diversity at all reflected in the political discourse of pretty much the leaders of any Canadian party. And finally, I see no difference between the policies of Justin Trudeau and Stephen Harper on this issue. I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
We're going to take 3 more questions now. I'm going to beg Ali to be a little bit shorter.
I'll try.
I also want to...
The mic's not working.
Mic's not working. I also want to encourage particularly people who don't agree with Ali's thesis, try to come forward, because we don't need a lot of people saying me too. We need people saying not me. So I encourage people in that context. Please, you're first.
I wanted to ask whether you ever thought of getting the children from both sides into a school system so as they grow up it becomes normal to mix. In the 1970s, there was a group started called the Dalkey School Project, and it was hard work going. And it was a multi-denominational, you couldn't say non-denominational because the Catholics would hit you. It was co-educational, it was democratically managed, and it was a national school, which is what a public school would be like. There are now over 80 in the Republic of Ireland. And it was amazing. And the thing that was amazing to me was of all the parent groups involved, the only group that asked that they have their Catholic classes were the Catholics. Everybody else did it in their churches. And so these children are now in their 40s, going on to their 50s, and I think this makes a tremendous difference. I was amazed that there were 80 because it was such a struggle at the beginning to get it. We finally got a Minister of Education who said, okay, we'll do it.
Okay.
But it was a struggle. But the thing is the young, when you get them together and it becomes normalized, is what we want.
Thank you. Yes.
Peter, I think it was my turn to ask the question, but that's okay. That's all right. We follow the principle that you have indicated before, is that raise the issue and lower the temperature. And this is very, very hard, as you know that. But we'll keep the motion, you know, in a perspective that we don't go out of the control. My question to him is, Ali Abunimah, is one is a comment and the other a question. One is that the one-state solution that I personally feel is far more impossible than the two-state solution. And the reason for that would be that a state, a regime that only know how to murder people, you would expect that regime to equally given the rights to their own people. I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime, unfortunately, but there is a possibility. And the possibility is only if the word corrupt leader stop the support, the blind support to that criminal government. That is the only possibility. We can do our part by promoting it and advocating it and educating the people. Until the government on their level involved, this will never happen. My other comment is, I'm going to finish it, is that what happened to Jerusalem if you have that one ideal state living side by side with the brothers and sisters, Jew and Christian and Muslim? Is the Jerusalem would be equally divided among all these three groups? Or should I say that it should be not a part of the country, but it should be given to an international taking care organization, because it's not a political or a geographical issue, it's a religious issue. Okay? We're talking about Muslim, Christians, and Jew, and there has to be, this is what I'm thinking. If not, what do you think, what should happen, where this should go?
Thank you. Green hat, there you go.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for not lecturing us about SNC Lavalin. I was a little scared at the beginning.
I thought you were going to ask a question.
No, I am. But it's related. So the last Liberal Justice Minister before Jody Wilson-Raybould was a guy named Irwin Cotler.
Yes.
And he likes to kind of promote this whole idea that Jews are indigenous to the Palestine or whatever. And what's very interesting now is that CIJA, the Center for Israeli Jewish Affairs, recently did a token press release with Perry Bellegarde, who's the chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And it's actually some Zionist organizations have indigenous people on their payroll, like a guy named Ryan Belrose, who works for B'nai B'rith. I haven't seen much rigorous analysis of this thing emerging, but I wonder what your thoughts about this, because it seems like there's this whole new Hasbara wave of using the language of it, this postmodern language of indigeneity to legitimize the Zionist project.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief, but they're such good questions. Of course, I believe that education is a critical part of this, and there have been in Palestine, among Israelis and Palestinians, schools of the kind you described as Oasis of Peace, Wahat Salam, Neve Shalom. There's also the hand-in-hand schools. But these are very small projects. The people involved in them like them and may turn out to be very wonderful people, but they're too small in a context where there's zero support for them, in fact hostility to them from the ruling state. And these kids, go back out into a society which is segregated and unequal in every way. A school by itself can't counteract that. So I think that those things can have value, but they're not a substitute for a fundamental transformation in the society that is not going to come about easily. I acknowledge that. The point that was made about Israelis would never accept, this keeps coming up, or the Israeli state would never accept. I'm saying they will never voluntarily accept to relinquish unjust power over Palestinians. This is not a question of asking nicely. But as I said before, which oppressor state ever did that? The South African apartheid regime didn't wake up one morning and say, oh, let's be nice. There had to be a struggle. There had to be efforts made to equalize the imbalance in power. As long as the strong remain strong and feel that their power is unassailable, they have no reason to change. So the struggle for us is not to persuade Israelis, just to persuade Israelis to say, look at my lovely vision for a peaceful future. That's not going to work by itself. There has to be a vision, but there also has to be a price for the status quo. And the price that the South African apartheid regime paid was international isolation. And Palestinians are calling for BDS on Israel for the same reason, to bring about justice, not to make Israelis suffer or to be mean to them for the sake of it, but because it's only when their power starts to erode that they will begin to look around. You read the memoirs of Mandela and F.W. de Klerk and all the books that come out of South Africa, and that's the message you get. It's that as long as we felt strong and we had international support, we could say the ANC is a bunch of terrorists and a bunch of communists. And we could send warplanes to Mozambique and to Angola and bomb their camps and say we don't care what the UN says. Once South Africa once the regime started to feel the walls closing in, they said, well, maybe we should actually talk to these people. So boycott, isolation, the sort of pat arguments you get against it is, oh, dialogue is so wonderful. Dialogue is the only way to solve problems. Go to Netanyahu, and he'll tell you, we're ready to talk to our neighbors with no conditions. We want peace. We're ready to talk. I'm ready to go to Riyadh. I'm ready to go to Beirut. Of course he'll say that, because talking is free. He will talk forever, while they bulldoze, while they destroy, while they build settlements. It's only when there's a price that the talking becomes real. Now, the question about, yes, the efforts to use or instrumentalize indigenous communities in North America, we've seen those. It's very interesting to follow debates, as I did a few months ago, actually in the summer, when the lacrosse team, the Haudenosaunee lacrosse team, went to Israel. And because the International Lacrosse Championships, and this is a team with members that come from both the United States and Canada, because of course the border goes through their territory. And the issue was that the Canadian government doesn't recognize their passports. And Israel said, oh, we'll recognize your passports if you come here. So for them it's a big deal to have a country recognize their passports. But there was a huge debate among, if you read Indian Country Today, there were a lot of, there were op-eds back and forth, debates about this use of indigenous struggles by a settler colonial state like Israel. So these things are being noticed, and people, particularly indigenous people, are pushing back against them, and that's really really incredible solidarity that is wonderful to see.
Sorry to say this, but I feel like your vision of one state is somewhat unrealistic. I feel like there's more and more pressure to label anyone who's criticizing the Israeli government as, or for example, the BDS movement as anti-Semitic. So what I'm thinking is, if there's more awareness to the public, like our role here as refugees living in other countries such as Canada or Europe or in the U.S. Is there a role for us to create awareness to people living here or everywhere else to help promote the cause of the Palestinians and help eliminate that idea of anti-Semitic for anyone who has criticism for the Israeli government?
Yeah. I'm
going against the rules here.
I know, but I just want to ask a clarification. I didn't see the connection between how the one-state solution is unrealistic and the rest of your question.
Well,
so I'd like to ask you to clarify that.
Yeah, I feel like relying on politicians or the UN is useless. So, that idea of creating one state, if it's proposed by politicians, it's not going to happen. But then, do we have other options, to promote other options or to create some pressure to have the solution for them?
Well, I'd ask you, what other options would you...
Like, what I'm saying is creating more awareness to the public, to have more pressure on the Israeli government or politicians who are supporting it.
Yeah.
Yes, Colin Stewart. I have a question, I have a comment, and I have a request.
30 seconds, 60 seconds, that's good, Colin.
And then I get in trouble because my answers are true.
A couple of weeks ago, we heard from Michael Link, who is the human rights rapporteur.
The special rapporteur.
Special rapporteur. What we did hear from him, rather belatedly, but I'm glad he said it, was that the Liberals have passed Bill C-85, which is the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. It's now on first reading in the Senate, and it's horrible because it does not recognize settlements on the West Bank, which means that those settlements can export articles to Canada under the label Made in Israel. So my request would be then that you call the senators, particularly the ISG senators, and just tell them, you want a hearing on this. We'll try
to do that?
Pardon? No, I'm asking everybody in the room to do it, for sure. I'm sorry. My question is this. Back in the days, I was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle here in Canada, in Botswana, and a little bit in South Africa. When we were involved, we were very clear in terms of boycotts, divestment, sanctions, and so on, that we had spoken to the workers who were picking the oranges in Orange Free State and so on, and who were producing wine and so on. We could go to them and say, how do you feel if we don't buy your products? My question, and I assume the answer is yes, but I'd like it confirmed or commented on, do we have the same confidence in relation to BDS with respect to Palestinians?
Stuart, before you go, I want to ask you to do something. There's a woman at the back in a wheelchair who can't come down. Could you take the microphone up there so that she could pose her question, please? Thank you.
The difference between your examples is that Israel was, people went there as a survival and with a huge psychic wound. As a social worker, I just find the root of the whole situation is the psychic damage that the Jews are there with. And the defensiveness and vulnerability that is not acknowledged, that's leading to such the attitude of, it's us against the world and we have to defend this little piece of territory, and what can be done about that base issue that's leading to such a strong reaction to sharing the land and having it democratically administered. there's such a deep wound that, and I find it absolutely incredible that people that have gone through that can inflict exactly the same thing within a generation. Like, it's just ridiculous, but that's the case. So I'm just struggling to figure out what the solution to that is, because I don't think there's going to be a solution without something acknowledging we have to deal with this wound and not, repeat it on other people. It's absolutely insane.
Well, maybe I'll start there. Of course, I think we have to be careful not to conflate Israel's use of the Holocaust as a justification for its existence and its oppression of Palestinians on the one hand, with the reality of Holocaust survivors and their trauma on the other, because the vast majority of Holocaust survivors did not go to Israel. Some did, and there's certainly no evidence I've seen that people who survived the Holocaust were principally responsible for inflicting suffering on Palestinians. And in fact, many or several prominent Holocaust survivors have been very outspoken. Auschwitz survivors have been very outspoken. We've published interviews, a series of interviews with them at the Electronic Intifada, in saying that their experience and their survival is what made them see how wrong it is that what Israel was doing. And and of course the leaders of the Zionist movement from the 1930s collaborated with, they signed the so-called transfer agreement with the Nazi government, or the Nazi government of Germany, breaking the international boycott of Germany that Jews in America and other places had called for. And the transfer agreement was quite notorious in terms of showing, not that I wouldn't go as far as to say the Zionists and Nazis were allies, but they saw a common interest in transferring Jews out of Germany into Palestine. So what I'm saying in answer to that is that the trauma of people who survived the Holocaust is not the explanation for why Israel behaves the way it does. And it's important not to allow Israel to exploit that trauma and that horror and that suffering, even rhetorically, to say, we came as survivors and therefore you have to give us a pass on what's happening to the Palestinians. And of course, the reality is that that there are still Holocaust survivors in Israel who are living in deep poverty. This is well documented. That very little of the funding that was supposedly given in reparations to the State of Israel actually went to Holocaust survivors, and certainly not enough to lift them out of poverty. And that's been a scandal in the last few years that has been well explored in the Israeli press. So what I'm saying is, be skeptical about Israel's claims that it is somehow providing justice or restitution or security to Jews because of the Holocaust. The evidence suggests otherwise, that the real security for Jews is to live in open, liberal, democratic societies that guarantee everybody's rights. And the argument Israel makes today to Jews around the world is, come here and be safe in the most dangerous country in the world for Jews. I mean, it makes no sense. They say, oh, Israel, we have to do all these things because that's the only way to guarantee the safety of Jews. But look at all the threats around us. We have Hezbollah, and we have Hamas, and we have Iran, and we have this. It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. Israel is an ethnocracy, a settler colony, and will use whatever excuse it can pull off the shelf to maintain that status. That was a long answer, I'm sorry. Okay. But, these are difficult questions. Okay. You'll remember during the anti-apartheid struggle, Mrs. Thatcher used to say, sanctions on South Africa hurt the people they're supposed to help. The argument was if you boycott businesses there, black workers will lose their jobs and lose their incomes. And the answer from Desmond Tutu was, don't polish our chains. Now we saw in the past 2 years, or 2-3 years ago, when there was a big international campaign against SodaStream, which had its factory in a settlement, an effort to trot out the same arguments and to say, oh, well, all these Palestinian workers will lose their jobs if you boycott SodaStream. Of course, the reality is that the only reason Palestinians have to work in settlements where there are no protections, where they're subject to abuse, where they're subject to checkpoints, where they have to work, be queuing up at checkpoints from 2 in the morning in order to get to a job at 7 in the morning, is because Israel has completely denied them the possibility of establishing and developing their own economy. So the settlement jobs are, at best a palliative, something that people do out of desperation. They're not an asset to Palestinians. And Palestinians have been very clear through their organizations, through the Boycott National Committee, through the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions, that they support BDS. And even in the SodaStream episode, the Palestinian workers refused to be used that way. Yes, a family may lose a job in the short term, but no one will say, we want to maintain settlements so we can have a job. You won't find a Palestinian who will say that. And I know people who've worked in the settlements and they say the same thing. We go because we have to feed our family, but they have reduced us to this. And we don't want to be in this situation. I think then there was a comment about the C-85 bill, and I just say, yes, call your senators.
Okay, we have 3 people lined up here, and I think that will be it, because we're now getting close to our end. So please respect your 1 minute if you can, and I'm sure Ali will be doing his bit to make sure we
Try. Don't ask such great questions.
Yes, yes or no answers.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful. I have a comment and a question. It's pertaining to Zionist ideology in and of itself. One of the ideological pillars of European anti-Semitism has been to conceive of the Jewish people as this monolithic, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic group, which obviously they're not. And Maxime Robinson, who wrote, which I believe to be the best work on Zionist ideology, Israël, un fait colonial, he noted that Zionism has internalized this classic anti-Semitic conception of what it means to be Jewish. And Shlomo Sand also reiterates this in many of his works. So ironically, Zionism is in and of itself a very anti-Semitic ideology. And my question would be, today there's this tendency to conflate anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, and we see it specifically when it's done against Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party. So I was wondering how effective do you think this strategy is, and whether or not you think Jeremy Corbyn will be able to resist, and if he does... Okay.
That's good stuff. Next, you've been very patient back here. One thing, I know some people dribbling out. If you didn't have your wallet right there when the pastor went by, there are people at the back willing to help out. So there you go. Please.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. I think I may be the only person here who doesn't think Israel is a criminal state, based on questions. So my comment is that the way you characterize Zionism, which I've identified with my entire life, and Judaism, which I happen to have grown up in, bears no resemblance to my understanding of either of those things. So the way you characterize Zionism, that doesn't align with my understanding of what I think I've been supporting all my life. And your characterization of Judaism, again, My experience of Judaism is, yes, there are a few outliers among Jews who don't support Zionism, but by and large, Jews support Zionism. So making that distinction is a little bit, I mean, it's technically true, but it's de facto to be the two groups overlap to a great deal. That's my comment. My question is, you were saying that as long as Israel has power, they won't talk and they won't make concessions. Okay, so my recollection of the history of the last few decades is different than that. And I'd want to hear what you think, or how you would characterize the ceding of power over territory under Israel's control to the PLO, the acceptance of the PLO to come within Israel's former boundaries, the boundaries that were controlled by them since '67, to form an armed force under the control of the PLO, and to devolve a certain amount of power to this body and a certain amount of control over the day-to-day lives of the majority of the Palestinians outside of pre-67 Israel. How is this not a concession by the more powerful party to the less powerful party? I would say in an effort to achieve a good faith effort to achieve peace.
Okay.
Thank you. Last word, then.
Yes. It's always very heartening, of course, when there is 200 people in a room and they're seeing, the full substance of the Palestine-Israel conflict and so on, and they understand the injustice of it in that forum. What I would like to see more of, and certainly from Electronic Intifada and all Palestinian solidarity, is a greater message that it's not just about Israelis and Palestinians. It's a world problem that has implications for every single person who lives on this planet, because Israel-Palestine as an issue is the greatest divisive force that keeps the United Nations, that keeps international law from functioning properly in order to deal with the world. So Israel-Palestine needs to come off the agenda so that we can get on with actually governing a healthier world. And so that's why the one-state solution is not just an esoteric, interesting question in that part of the world. It's of interest to the entire world. And I think we need to do a better job if we want to reach more people, that it actually has implications, real world implications for more than just people who are interested in Israel-Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, okay, one more.
Just my question to you is related to the deal of the century involving the Middle East countries.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. All right, we'll need another half hour. I have 2 minutes. Look, and I apologize if I don't get to everyone's question, because there was a lot. But the answer to you is that Israel conceded no land to Palestinians. The Oslo Accords were very specific in giving Palestinians no jurisdiction over land. The Palestinian Authority forces only have jurisdiction over Palestinian bodies, which means that if a settler shoots dead a Palestinian, Palestinian security forces, so-called, have no authority to arrest the settler or interdict the settler. So what you have is what you have is a Bantustan force. The PLO agreed to become the Bantustan police for the Israeli occupation, and that's how they have functioned for 25 years. And that's why Israel argues for the US to continue funding the Palestinian Authority, because they see the Palestinian Authority as a cheap way to run the occupation, while Israel has continued stealing land, demolishing homes, killing Palestinians with total impunity, turning Gaza into a sealed ghetto, which is unlivable. And that's Zionism. I mean, that's not the Zionism you experienced, but it's the Zionism Palestinians experience. And so I understand that from the comfort of Canada, you can have these romantic notions about planting trees and putting money in J&F boxes. But for Palestinians, those trees are planted on their land, on their villages. For you to go to this, have this lovely experience going to Israel and saying, my homeland means Palestinians have to live in refugee camps because they can't be there, because you wouldn't like to see them living on their land. You wouldn't like that. It wouldn't be a Jewish state if Palestinians lived on their land. That's Zionism. And if you're a Zionist, that's fine, but you have to own up to it. The price of a Jewish state means Palestinians are forever excluded from their homeland, forever in ghettos, forever refugees, forever alienated. That's the reality of Zionism. Not the romantic notion of Zionism, but the reality of it. And I understand that that's hard to come to terms with, because it's not how you feel you are. You feel you're a good person who supports something lovely. But it's not lovely when you're in Gaza. It's not lovely when you're in the Negev and Israel is destroying your home for the 100th time to build a new Jewish-only town. It's not lovely when you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel who cannot study in a university in your own indigenous language. Do you know there's no university in Israel that teaches as a language of instruction in Arabic? That's Zionism. So you can love it, you can hate it, but that's the reality. And it doesn't look like it's getting better. It looks like it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse and more extreme. So if that's what you support, you've got to own up to it. That's what I'm saying. And many Jews don't support it. And I think it's wrong to keep insisting that Jews who don't identify with this, Jews who reject this, Jews who are in solidarity with Palestinians, who I see everywhere and every day, that they don't exist, that they're some tiny minority. They do exist, and they're loud, and they're vocal, and increasingly so. And that is making the Israel lobby groups in Canada, you know, groups like CIJA and B'nai B'rith, in the US, groups like AIPAC and the ADL, uncomfortable. Because for decades they had a monopoly where they said, we are the Jewish community. And now particularly young Jews, but Jews of every age, are saying, no, you don't speak for us. This inhumanity is not in our name. And we stand with Palestinians. And that's a fantastic thing, because they are drawing on the values that they learned from their Judaism, that says you treat others the way you want to be treated. And so I insist, as a Palestinian and as a human being, that I refuse to say that, no matter what the numbers are, I refuse to equate Jews with Zionists, I refuse to equate Judaism with Zionism, and I refuse to accept that Israel speaks for all Jews in the world. I will never accept that, because to do so would be to concede to the false claim that these things done to Palestinians are done in the name of Jews, and I won't do it.
Committee, Ida Henderson, to come and give a little gift to Ali Abunimah.
It's a real pleasure, Ali, to be able to say thank you. It's a very small token, but